came to this community working with the Greenpoints a bit this summer. I was working with an adaptation to climate change project in the Brazilian semi-arid with smallholder farmers and drip technology last summer, and I've worked on community-based water solutions to specific challenges both urban and rural, rainwater harvesting and ceramic water filters.
I'm Liam, and I'm an architect and sort of interested in this world, and Lisa and I did the last FarmHackNYC together, and sort of interested in this world and sort of like grassroots organization and how that figures into architecture and city planning at large, and there are these two worlds that are sort of at odds with each other, but it seems to be the place that I keep being gravitated towards. So this is maybe not to add more things into your brain, which has been a full morning, but this is maybe telling the kind of a story at the end that hopefully can move us into what we're going to be doing, the discussions and more productive stuff we're going to be doing later. So this is talking in general about what it is cultivating this resilient network that I think we only need to explain so much because we all kind of know what that already is. It's everything that we've been hearing about this morning and yesterday. And I think it's just interesting also to know that we know that this is FarmHack, and we know that the site is sort of the urban farm, but I think it's also important to see that we're talking about this whole family or collection or network of projects that aren't necessarily digging in the ground and producing food, but that's part of this sort of really important network or infrastructure in the city. It is maybe on the scale of other types of networks infrastructure in the city. And I think it's valuable to think about it that way and think about how we are describing what this is or what this looks like. And it's not necessarily that we need to have a map like the MTA system of what this is and what this can do, but it's really important to think about it, especially in context of this is the map that MTA released right after Sandy of all the down networks. And so, the city provides this great image of what the city looks like and how the city functions. And it's a really robust system. But in the moments when it goes down, there's sort of, we understand the value, really the value of this kind of infrastructure that we're developing here today.
So we've been thinking about disruption, Sandy particularly, in the city, and how that fosters emergence and what some lessons from that are in terms of the kind of organizing and innovation that we do as a community and individually. There is a sense in which a sort of a normative space between houses that demarcates property has been used for people to come together to solve a problem, engaging in a different way than they would have in that space normally. Similarly, on the street, infrastructure like electricity that you don't usually think of as part of the logic of the city because it comes so naturally. A public zone becomes a place of mutual subsistence and problem solving, and also coming together to share these more intimate things like food and community, discussing together and being in public in common.
And it's in these sort of citywide moments of emergency that we really notice things in the city. When everything's moving smoothly, you don't really see that things are big for the city, the things that go through our body, and when that's happening smoothly, you don't notice until there are stoppages in these flows. And this is, shot outside a fairway of food that was waiting to be thrown away because it had been flood damage. And it's views like this that you really understand how much we consume and what a problem it is when there's a stoppage somewhere along that flow. And in another way to think about this is an artist who's been taking pictures of what families consume in a week. But just this view is this view you don't normally see, but as soon as you get to see what this collection of things and food and items that a family is made of, you really understand what becomes a much fuller story about what that family is, and really a much more personal story about how a family works together and uses these different items and how they buy them and where they're buying them. And then seeing that compared to another type of family somewhere else in the world, the very different story it's telling about a similar arrangement of things. The size of the family is different, where the food obviously comes from is different, how the food is gotten and prepared becomes different.
And all of these stories together, the portraits on display, sort of in the way that this FarmHack event has been arranged, starts to make a more complex network of interdependent relationships and variables. All the stories become complementary, and we also develop sort of relationships between them that tell us a much larger picture. And it's sort of an interesting way in which the city itself, the infrastructure, there's the facade that's sort of normal, you see it, see a very intimate zone where a family or a person lives and what that arrangement looks like. It's a way of storytelling, a way of somehow relating to the items in the refrigerator which tell a different but similar kind of story. It's arrangement, it's preference, it's taste, it's relationship to being a consumer, and how we sort of create independently and co-create these stories.
Yeah, maybe the refrigerator is a way to move back into something that is from the state of emergency into something that all of a sudden becomes something that we all understand, that these are like culturally created, you know, the refrigerator becomes...
What is that?
I mean, like Cribs sort of makes, or like MTV makes, or we just know that the refrigerator is something that we all have, and we understand something about everybody when we open up that refrigerator. And there's maybe something valuable to think about in moving back to the farm, and maybe there's a way of thinking about this zone, this urban farming zone, which is farms and all of this related infrastructure that is like that open view of a refrigerator. And the really great thing when that happens in a street and it doesn't take a storm to rip these things open, or sort of a show on MTV. And then I think it's also important to point out, just talking about emergency quickly, is obviously, I think, as a lot of people know, that there have been times in Brooklyn where food was generated here, primarily, and it's because of these sort of state of emergencies and food crises. During World War II, the rise of Victory Gardens, during the Depression era, the rise of subsistence gardens and Ruth Gardens, they really were producing a large amount of food for the city.
So it's not so much a comparison of emergency and emergence, but just thinking about the conditions through which different kinds of collaborations, innovation, different kinds of networks, stories emerge, and products as well. So we have the state of emergency where people come together to create new ways for the city. And then there are other models, and that's one of the things that we sort of wanted to provoke a conversation about, is what are the objectives of the different models, and they're obviously multiple. In this case, we have a community store in Brooklyn that's maybe an aestheticization or a fetishization of this local food movement, which isn't bad or good, but it does create a market and supports products. Perhaps the metric of success in this case isn't community or feel good. Principally, it doesn't have to be profit-oriented, and that's not a bad or good thing. We just want to talk about a little bit what the stories we tell and what we choose other values and metrics for our projects. In emergency, it's easier to find, get the water out of the basement, or get the cat out of the tree, or whatever more profound example. But we've been thinking about branding, or where the source of the products come from, or how we might independently define feeling good, or treating each other well, or duration. Maybe it's something that doesn't need to last a very long time. Maybe it's that one moment where something happens and it's really meaningful. So success can be this very sort of multifaceted concept.
I mean, there's also questions that can be determined today, or that's the value of a group like this, is to talk about what that means and to not have it always be individually defined.
So yeah, we've been just thinking about in what ways does this like larger, perhaps top-down or policy or economic thinking frame the way that we also perceive and talk about and build up the urban farm, our urban farm community. We're telling the next part of the story, 3 phases: cultivating emerging spaces, sustaining the community, and storytelling about it.
I think this is just our way of trying to make sense of this, tell the kind of the story of grassroots, or create the other version of that map on the left. And you trying to find other language, we're not always reverting back to the language that the city uses, or the language that the market uses, or that entrepreneurs use. So first it's about finding this emergent space, which I think just really quickly, is this kind of interdisciplinary practice that everyone here seems to be somehow or another involved in, is these mashing together of 2 spaces, which for right now in a really simple way is the city and a farm that creates this new space, and that could be something that's a lot more specific about a very particular site. But that creation of a new space, and then, as we all sort of know, that this requires a new kind of expertise, a new sort of job is created, and that this becomes, that this becomes a site for opportunity.
And a site for challenges. So, there are many ways of, again, framing the problems and the challenges within the community, and it's interesting to think about in what ways we fit into an already developed market and fulfill the desires of it, and in what ways we develop whole new system, and where is the tension between those and what elements do we want to keep. Traditionally, we have this sort of maker versus or independent from taker model, which is what I guess we've been calling top-down or like citywide logic, and making these things kind of equivalent, but where there's a maker of an object and there's an assumed taker somewhere out there, whether it's China making it for the US or whether it's someone cooking it and somebody out there is eating it, there's this sort of space between those. And we're thinking about where the cultivating spaces and practicing ways towards creating more equal ground and more of an iterative process between the maker and the taker, where they are interrelated, where they're informing one another, and where that information and evolution between the two can continue to constantly reform, evolve, and adapt to generate new cycles of relationship. And I don't think that this necessarily means we reject the self-serving part, however you define that. I mean, we all have to live in various planes, and also the self-taking, what's gratifying about being a consumer can continue, but that there is a more equal commons is kind of also thinking about these projects as like an extended, or it's a new kind of family in a way that we relate to the making and the taking in our own lives and in the lives of our projects.
And I think it's really important just to change language, even talking about what it means to be in a family versus in a business cooperative, which are very different ideas, and that maybe this is a way of talking about what it means to be an entrepreneur or making business for yourself in a different way. In this, if it is this really simple diagram, you make something and you give it to a consumer who will want to buy it once you make it, and that's really doesn't seem to be what this community is about, but it's really about sort of collaboratively making things together and then collaboratively taking those things together and enjoying them together. And really the product, maybe even more than food and even more than like innovative devices, really is generating that family-like environment where things are created and shared. Like the dinner we had last night, I mean, these things that really seem to be what this is worth, really. So maybe, and then maybe that diagram is something that is a little more sustainable and that is a different way of talking about what we're doing, a different way of thinking about what these organizations of people are. That this is maybe a type of system that's bound by trust and by these interpersonal relationships that we have, and things like honor and all the things that you would talk about in a family, but not so much in a business.
And also where the product is process that can change and that continue to create new products, but that aren't bound by one singular outcome or definition or container.
We sort of talked. I guess we sort of talked about that, but this is something maybe like a weather cellar or something that just sort of happens naturally, but that we can sort of encourage and to create something that does continue to happen over and over, hot air rising before they're sinking. And I think also just being open to the fact that there are these inputs and outputs, there are these release valves in the system, and it's okay to sometimes be self-serving or sometimes be self-taking. That those are, that's just part of how we move through these different, it's not about this family in the woods, but that we're part of a series of families that we're sort of navigating between. And then sort of maybe that's what this is, and those inputs and outputs, which could be seen as selfishness in a smaller scale, at a bigger scale, is the way that we're moving and navigating and connecting this larger network of families or groups or organizations.
I think just to expand on the metaphor of the weather current, we think about our individual projects and how they relate both internally to like our specific microclimate dynamics and how that also makes a bigger weather system. And it is a highly localized thing at one moment and also complex on a larger scale. That's where storytelling becomes interesting. I think that the stories that we're developing in this room are not at all singular or linear, and maybe that's not what we're seeking. Like mapping a weather current or an extreme weather current, there's a tornado and it is one big movement and it's passing through a space. But there's also, in this movie Twister, there's that sort of design cell that has its own internal logic that travels through that storm and responds to other pieces of the storm and then continues to move and continues to be part of tracking that storm.
So, and I think this is a dark image, but that's the image in Wizard of Oz. It sort of whirring around in that twister, and that you're aware of all these things that are moving in this chaotic patterns, and also recognizing that those are your neighbors, and those are people, and those are like, that we have sort of, and we can be sort of swept up in this twister, or have some sort of like, some sort of agency or way of communicating, or at least like, if nothing else, and it's creating that fantasy world that she ends up creating for the next 2 hours. So maybe it's something like this, where we're creating the landscape that we want to be working in. We're arranging these sort of families that is really what seems to be important, is the group of people that we feel good about working with. And then we get to move, sort of, that is the pleasure of being in the city, is getting to move in our own way through that.
And that is actually, the definition of resilience is being able to move into a state that's at least as desirable as the one before it. So that usually happens without path dependence, where you get stuck in one way of thinking or working, and you can start to understand the diversity of positions and expertise and different kinds of the multifaceted nature of this community and how we complement and work together as part of your resilient network.
And I think, I don't know how helpful this is. I mean, it's also, I think, us trying to figure out our role within the system, and it's something that is clearly very valuable in the making of cities, and that maybe is not talked about enough outside of these smaller groups of people that are deeply interested in these things, and how we open up to these larger systems, and that it's okay that this system is part of a storm network and part of the political system and part of this sort of like infrastructure which we love to hate and all those other things.
Yeah, I think the one last thing, I mean, a lot of the conversation that developed around this has to do with in what ways policy at the city level can help our individual projects without taking away what's really beautiful about the grassy and the rootsy parts of it, which are that we have our own internal definitions of success that do often include having these other central objectives of just like having fun, or maybe we spend the budget on beer one night, or like, these other things, and how policy can systematize some of these experiences and make them stronger, but also lend enough flexibility to the individuality and to the texture and the flavor and the really maybe more interesting parts of the project, which are also the challenges.